Hi, I'm Dr. Selena Fisk, and welcome to this episode of Make Data Talk. In this podcast, I help you turn your spreadsheets into stories in a way that is practical, accessible, and hopefully a whole lot more useful than your grade 9 maths textbook. Today, I'm going to be talking about the difference between being evidence-based and evidence-informed. This episode is inspired by a book I read recently, and I reckon this idea is super relevant in our data world, particularly when we're thinking about the actions and the so what and the what's next once we've done a dig into our data. As you probably know by now, my two data storytelling questions that I use in day-to-day work what are the trends and the insights in the data? That's the first question. And then the second question is, well, what do I do with that information now? What are my possible actions, or what are my next steps? And sometimes I work with leaders and with teams who do the analysis, and we might be looking at their data, we might be identifying trends and insights. And then they kind of turn to me and say, well, what should we do? What are some of those possible actions that we should take? And I'm not the best person to, tell people what they should do because I'm not always over their context. I don't always, I haven't necessarily worked in their organisation, but I can direct them to, I guess, being informed by research and other case studies and thinking about the context and all of that to inform the decisions that they make. And that happens a lot in my work. And in most industries that we work in, we're working with complex human beings in complex systems, and there's very rarely a set solution or a fixed solution to what, I guess, or how we fix or how we address gaps in performance. I've recently been listening to, on Audible, the book called Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity, and it's by Dr. Peter Attia and Bill Gifford. And it's a really fascinating read about increasing lifespan, and Healthspan more specifically. So Healthspan, Peter Attia kind of talks about is the addition of potentially 1 to 2 decades worth of life onto the end of our lives, but also not just the addition of more time, but the addition of time, that is a much higher quality than what we might have had otherwise. And he talks about, we shouldn't just be thinking about lifespan anymore, just as like how long can we live, but we should be thinking about this health span and how well are we living and how well can we engage in, the day-to-day activities that we actually love doing and that help us to kind of flourish and to thrive. He has this model, I guess, that he talks about in his book, and it's really resonated with me from a data perspective. But he says, historically, what we've had and the medicine that we've had up until now has largely been what he calls medicine 2.0. In medicine 2.0, if there's something wrong with us, if we're not feeling very well, we might go to our GP and we tell the GP our symptoms, and then the GP recommends some possible actions or interventions that we might be able to take. If those actions or interventions work, then great, we're a bit healthier, we might feel a bit better and all is well. If they don't seem to work, we would probably go back to our GP, and then they would send us probably for some follow-up tests, or they might send us to a specialist. And so in this model of medicine 2.0 that Peter Attia talks about in the book Outlive, he kind of says that the actions are really, they're a reaction. So it's the action by the GP and by potential specialists is prompted by a problem in the first place. And he says that we should be rethinking medicine 2.0 and thinking more about something that he terms medicine 3.0, which is more preventative medicine. So rather than waiting until something goes wrong, actually getting medical help and guidance prior to things going wrong. And, as I said, the goal for him is to increase our health span. One of the challenges that he kind of talks about with this different model is that he says medicine 2.0 has historically really heavily relied on an evidence base. So it's relied on randomized controlled trials. It's relied on decades worth of clinical trials that indicate that that particular contraceptive medication actually works for, 99% of women. Or we know that there's a couple of products on the market that are very commonly used antidepressants that will help boost mood. We know the medications to use when, somebody has high cholesterol or cardiovascular disease. We know the medications that suit us and work really well. And we know how to support people who are diabetic, for example. And we know those things because of these randomized controlled trials, which means that hundreds or thousands, usually thousands of people have been through clinical trials, and there is a really solid evidence base around what works and I guess how efficient and how effective it's going to be and how likely it is to actually work in our scenario. He says, though, in Medicine 3.0, we actually need to lean a little bit more on being evidence-informed. So rather than the evidence base of these decades of clinical trials that are used in Medicine 2.0, he says Medicine 3.0 is more evidence-informed. And he says we're learning about what contributes to Healthspan every day. And we, I guess, are building our knowledge, we're building our understanding. And unfortunately, right now, we don't have decades and decades of randomized controlled trials that really back up or, I guess, provide a really solid evidence base for this preventative medicine. And he says that in a world where we're living in a Medicine 3.0 kind of world, he says we should be informed by the bits of evidence and I guess the crumbs that are being left by smaller studies over smaller periods of time, and we should be trying to implement them as much as possible. And he uses some different examples around, some of the ones that I can think of are around supplements. He talks about the impact of supplements. Again, we don't necessarily, for all the supplements that are recommended to us, we don't have decades necessarily of clinical trials of that particular product of people maybe your age. He also talks about infrared saunas, and there's a lot of research around the health benefits of infrared saunas, but again, we don't have decades of clinical trials to back up those decisions. And he kind of says, well, what do we do then? What position, we're kind of in this position where we don't have a really strong evidence base. We have some good evidence that's kind of coming through to us right now, but we don't have randomized controlled trials. So he says we've basically got two choices, and this is obviously me paraphrasing him because he doesn't say it in a way that's this blunt, I guess. But he basically says we have two choices. We can either ignore the crumbs of evidence that we're getting, and we can wait until there is a solid evidence base, and then down the track, when that evidence base exists, then we can make some decisions. He said, but in some cases that could be 100 years away, so we could wait for that. Or we could pick up the crumbs and we could try to make evidence-informed decisions with the bits we know, and we could be open to learning and modifying what we do on this, on this journey. And then we hopefully contribute to our health span and expand our life, add those decades. But we also tweak our understanding of what's good for us and what works as we progress and as we age. I really love this idea of evidence-based versus evidence-informed, because when I work with people who say, what does the evidence say and what decisions should I definitively make right now about this particular thing? We don't always have an evidence base to back up our decisions. It's, like in Medicine 3.0, we don't necessarily have decades and decades of data that tells us what the most effective interventions would be in that specific context that you're working in. We might be able to find a handful of case studies. We might know from experience what's worked for us in other organisations previously. We might learn from colleagues or from guest speakers or from people running professional learning sessions. We might learn about some of those strategies that work. And again, kind of like what Peter Attia says, we've got two choices here. We can either wait for definitive evidence-based strategies before we implement anything, or we can be informed by those crumbs and we can combine them with our understanding of the quantitative information, with our understanding of what research is around, what case studies are around, what we know about our context and what we know from our previous professional experience. And we can use all of that information together and combined to be evidence-informed in our actions. in an earlier podcast episode, I talked a lot about the distinction between being data informed and data driven, and talked then about the idea of when we're informed, we're packaging up all of those different types of information together, and then we're using it collectively to inform the decision that we're making. And this example from Peter Attia around being evidence-based or evidence-informed is much the same. We want to be paying attention to the information that we've got. We obviously want to be making smart decisions, and we don't want to be, reckless in our decision-making. But there's an element of we are trying to predict what's most likely to work, given what we know the performance has been in the past, given what we know about from research, from case studies, from other professionals, from our experience, all of those things packaged up. And so we're attempting things in a way that is intelligent, it's measured, it's calculated, we're being really discerning in our thinking, we're not being ad hoc, but equally, we can't wait to act because we don't have a really solid evidence base sitting underneath us. So this is just a bit of a reminder this week in this week's episode to maybe get out of your own way. If you've been procrastinating on some action because you're looking for some more evidence, what breadcrumbs do you have? If you're triangulating data, if you're collecting information on what's happening in your organisation and what's happening in the broader field from multiple different sources, and you're triangulating that information and you're attempting to make an intelligent decision about what your next steps are, I would encourage you to think about taking those next steps and doing the things. Otherwise, you might be waiting a really long time. So thanks so much for joining us this week on this episode of Make Data Talk. This podcast also appears as a newsletter on LinkedIn. It's called Make Data Talk as well, and you can find that under my profile at Dr. Selena Fisk. I've also got a newsletter. If you'd like to sign up, it's available at selenafisk.com. But as always, feel free to like and share this podcast with other people who you feel might find it interesting. And thanks so much for joining us. Take care.